Although family farming has moved largely towards plant and seed harvesting in recent decades, hog and cattle raising operations were still fairly commonplace in Indiana well into the mid-1990s. As such, a farm's livestock operations normally required a series of open sewage ponds. These were sometimes referred to as lagoons, open-air cesspools, or manure pits. This was done to hold the waste of dozens, if not hundreds, of animals. Each year, a few dozen farmers are killed working in and around these pits due to the emittance of deadly methane, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide gas. When I was a boy about 8 years old, this is precisely what happened to me. On a very warm, low-wind day, I was overcome by the smell of sulfur while walking between a hog finishing barn and an open sewage pond. I can still recall a split second of diminishing consciousness as I began falling forward towards the ground. The patch of grass I landed on is exactly where my NDE began. I found myself 30 to 40 feet high up in the air and looking down at the scene below. I can accurately judge it to be this height as there was a utility or telephone pole many yards in front of me. I remember wondering to myself many days later, how did I climb to the top of that telephone pole? From the sky above, I began to fall towards the ground. As I fell, I noticed a black hole near the green grass on the ground below. The hole seemed too small as I fell towards it. As I got closer to the hole, I kept right on falling. There was no ground to hit. The falling felt like I had pierced a veil of some sort as I slid through the tiny dark hole and entered a tunnel within. The tunnel was black inside and growing larger as I rapidly fell into it. I wasn't heading forward and towards any sort of light as others describe. I was looking back towards the entrance of the tunnel. My childlike humanity faded and I became older and more adult in my thought processes. I had a clear sense that I had been on this ride before, that I had died, and that I was returning to my wiser form of consciousness. I had a few downloads during this tunnel experience, some of which I struggle to remember to this day. This pains me a great deal as I can remember the circumstance, but I can't remember the precise information I was gathering. One message or feeling I do recall was that this life I had just exited was similar to a game. There were many ways to play the game, and some ways were much better than others. I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I wish I could do that life over. How could I forget that? I wonder how far I could get if I could remember to do life that way. In these recollection moments of the tunnel ride, I was somewhat bummed that I didn't perform better in my short 8-year-old life, but it was a happy-go-lucky kind of bummed. At some point here, the speed slowed and I entered a space with panoramic screens all around. It was like multiple TVs butted up next to one another. This was the beginning of a brief life review. I mainly saw images of my mother and sister, but I was very confused. I knew the time, place, and circumstance that I was witnessing, but it was as if I was experiencing it from a different angle in the room. It was déjà vu, but from another vantage point, but I watched it differently this time. I will note that this was a deep, emotionally painful life review in my experience. It was not a physical pain. I felt what my mother and sister had felt in those moments and how my young words had affected them. It was the feelings of shame, regret, remorse, jealousy, and sadness, but multiplied times 1,000. These feelings I took on grew to a crescendo. Those feelings and emotions were pouring into me, and I could barely take it anymore. I wanted so badly for it to stop. Suddenly, those horrible human emotions just fell away. The pain was over in an instant. Somehow from here, I ended up walking in a meadow. I knew this place. I loved it. This meadow was one of my absolute favorite places, despite never experiencing this anywhere on Earth. Still, I knew that I'd taken this walk before in these fields and this crisp air. It was like a long walk home. This was the first time I knew where I was headed during this experience. Today, 30 plus years later, I find myself sad because I cannot remember more of the above-mentioned place and the happiness I had and have had in that meadow. Moreover, I cannot determine where the field led me, per se. I found myself in a giant hall, or room. I had people who knew me here. They were family members and ancestors. It was as if they were lined up, like sitting on bleachers alongside a basketball court. I knew them all. Some were seemingly older and more matriarchal or patriarchal than others. I walked back and forth speaking with many of them. Again, I will note that I cannot name any of these people that I knew. Perhaps this is because I had not experienced any death as of yet in my short 8-year lifetime. I do recall 1 or 2 conversations that I had with a woman who knew me. She asked, "Have you talked to him yet?" I just sort of laughed back and said, "Nah, he knows I'm going back." Odd as this may sound to the reader, I believe this was in reference to God, or a god of some sort. In this experience, I recognized God as being off to my right, but he was simply there as a bright, shining light. I saw no physical or human-like manifestation of him whatsoever. Nothing Jesus-like either. Then I remember chit-chatting with a few other people and I told them, "Yeah, I'm going back." There was an understanding that going back would be difficult, and I nodded along. Unfortunately, that is all I can remember of this great hall and ancestor experience. Finally, I ended up in a smaller room or area within a large building. The architecture was very Greek in design, with columns and white marble. Here I met with a love interest, a romantic twin flame sort of relationship. We spoke to each other at length, and I recall discussing with her that we'd be gone for a while, meaning gone from each other. I was going to be heading back to my body, and she would not be reincarnating back into waking life for quite some time. There was a knowing that our lives on Earth wouldn't exactly overlap, but that she would be much younger than I in this earthly realm. We said our goodbyes, and she knew I had work to do. I surely wish I could remember more of her, and more of this portion of my NDE, but I simply cannot. I have no idea if I'll meet up with this person in this life or not. But it has made dating interesting, and sometimes I chuckle when I run into someone new and a little younger than me. Boom. I was back in my body and on that patch of grass. My NDE was over. I was not found by anyone, and nobody witnessed me unconscious on the ground that day. I simply came to on my own. I got up slowly, dazed, and walked towards our house about 50 yards away. As I walked back, that was the first time I stared up at that telephone pole, wondering when and how I had been able to climb up there and look down at the ground. At the time, I spoke nothing of this NDE to my parents or to anyone. I was 8 years old and didn't understand any of it myself. I didn't wrap my head around the experience until I was well into my 30s. Much of it would be what you'd recall later as the memories came back in waves. I had never heard of the term NDE before, nor had any formalized idea these experiences reportedly existed. Many other NDE experiencers have reported wanting to stay on the other side, or not come back. For weeks following my NDE, I would go outside when my parents were gone and lay down on the exact same spot of grass that I had my experience. I'd close my eyes and try so hard to go back to that place. Shortly after that, for whatever reason, I buried much of the experience in my psyche. In fact, I refused to even walk near that area of the farm at all. I'm not sure why, but I became scared of it, causing me to bury the memories even further in my mind. As I did so, I began having intense dreams for weeks following the NDE. These were vivid, out-of-body dreams, with some of them being quite nightmarish. Eventually, they dissipated, as did many of the NDE memories. This story was shared by Brad and happened in 1992.